right. Hello everybody, and welcome to this first episode of Determinate Content. And today we are here with Thomas Hofweber, who is professor of philosophy at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he is the author of Ontology and the Ambitions of Metaphysics, and Idealism and the Harmony of Thought and Reality, which is forthcoming with the Oxford University Press. And today we are discussing his article with the same name from 2019, Idealism and the Harmony of Thought and Reality. And before we get started, I just want to say a few words about this project. So basically, Determinate Content is a podcast where we'll be discussing sort of contemporary issues in metaphysics, meta-ontology, metaphysics, meta-ethics, and also sort of related areas with the theorists behind the papers themselves. So, and today we're here with Thomas Hofweber. So thank you so much for coming with us today. And
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So I would just would you just start with introducing yourself briefly, and how did you get into doing philosophy and metaphysics, and also if you can answer, do you think it's a worthwhile pursuit to do that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I mean, I got into philosophy kind of like many people, sort of by accident. I mean, I encountered it early on in my university career, and was fascinated with it and stuck with it ever since. I got into metaphysics, I guess, partly because those are the questions that interested me the most, and also because I felt like maybe I had more of a sense of what the right thing to say was than in some other areas. Is it a worthwhile pursuit? For me, absolutely. I mean, is it worthwhile for me personally? I think the answer to me is clearly yes, because I'm fascinated by the questions. I really like engaging with those questions and, discussing it with other people and so on and so forth. And it's a great project to be in particular, also if you have a job. So if you get paid to do it, that's especially good. So I can highly recommend it. I mean, maybe you're alluding to these sort of, does it make sense for humanity overall to engage in philosophical pursuits? I mean, that's maybe a more difficult question because it's hard to justify, what humanity as a whole should do. But presumably the answer is also clearly yes, in light of how little overall of the resources of humanity are invested in philosophical activity. It's definitely worthwhile, I think.
Right. Yeah, and maybe we'll get into that question also in relation to the article. But yeah, so let's get into the paper. So the paper concerns idealism, and you could say that it more generally concerns the question of the place of human minds in reality, the metaphysical place of human minds. And I was wondering if you could expound on the meaning of this notion of having a place in reality. And
okay. So this is basically sort of the target question that I'm trying to make progress on. Like, what is the significance of human beings in reality overall? And so when people think about that question, they often think about like the moral significance, like, do human beings have a distinct moral status or something like that? And I don't want to talk about that one. I want to talk about, is there a metaphysical significance to human beings? So do human beings play a special role in the overall metaphysics of reality? Okay, and so that's sort of like the question about what the place is of human beings in the world overall. And so I think that, there's like two common answers to that question. The first one is like, this is kind of like from the article, but I guess I'm allowed to repeat that because the audience hasn't read it, obviously. Yeah. The first question is that, human beings have no special significance in the world. They're just like, an accidental result of evolutionary processes, and the world overall, is not specially connected to the appearance or existence or any other features of human beings. And so that's sort of the negative naturalistic answer. And the standard positive answer is a theistic answer, where the thought is that human beings do have a metaphysically special place in the world because they have a special connection to a divine being. And that divine being, on one version at least, created the world for human beings, the material world at least. So there's a special place of human beings in that world because they have a connection to the very reason why there's this world at all, and things like that. And so neither one of these answers are basically the ones that I'm pursuing. want to pursue a third answer, which is an idealist answer, which says, in essence, that there's an intimate connection between the human mind and reality itself. So there's some connection between those two things, such that the overall metaphysical story of all of reality must, make that connection explicit or leave something important out.
Right.
So so the metaphor is that if you write the overall metaphysical story of all of reality, do you have to mention human beings as a crucial part in the main text of this? That's sort of the metaphor, right? And if there is this intimate connection between our minds and reality itself, then the answer would have to be yes, obviously. And so that would justify, a sort of a third positive idealist answer about the metaphysical significance of human beings, via this connection of our minds to reality itself.
Yeah, right.
So that's the target. I want to present an argument for an idealist view of that kind that would answer the sort of like what I call like the big question about our place in reality.
Yeah.
In a positive way, without connections to a divine being.
Right. But it's not any type of idealism you're arguing for, because you're not arguing for idealism about the totality of things, right? About ontological idealism. You're arguing for Alethic realism, which is idealism, which is idealism about what is the case. And I know from elsewhere, I think you argue against ontological idealism or on other grounds. But I was wondering.
Okay, so let's just so this is you're correct in a number of ways, but so at first I think so you can wonder what is idealism first of all, right? So it's about the place of minds in reality, the metaphysical place of minds in reality. So the way I like to characterize it, and maybe we can talk about that later. So is that that minds play a metaphysically central role in reality, and reality so far is just understood neutrally. And then you can make that more precise. You could say that, well, do minds play a metaphysically central role in reality as to the totality of things, or reality as to the totality of facts? So either one of those would be good enough to defend the idealist vision and the positive answer to our place in the world. I believe that the correct way to defend idealism is by focusing on reality as the totality of facts, not on reality as the totality of things. And so it's a special challenge for the kind of idealism that I want to defend. Is I want to say that reality as the totality of things is completely independent of us, with leaving aside the trivial things like that this mouse is human made and stuff like that. But in general, what exists is independent of us, but which facts obtain, or the totality of facts, is not independent of us. And so to combine those two is a challenge that is in particular developed in the book, not so much in the paper, but that's basically just so to clarify the background. So I want to say that either version of idealism would be good enough to answer the big question about our place, in particular if our minds are metaphysically central to either what exists or what is the case. But the view that I believe is the correct one is if you focus on what's the case, not what exists.
Right. Okay. So we're just kind of building up for the main argument in the paper. So we'll get to that. But another key concept, I think, is the notion of structural affability. You distinguish content affability from structural affability, but with regards to this kind of Alethic idealism about what is the case, structural affability is important. So could you just say what is structural affability? And
all right. So taking it from this last one. So suppose we're thinking about reality as the totality of facts. Okay, all the facts that obtain. Is there a special connection between our minds and reality as the totality of facts? So a starting point for looking into such a connection is to think about the relationship between the facts that obtain and our conceptual representations of the facts. So in the simplest case, you take a subject predicate representation, like the Eiffel Tower is tall or whatever, and you take a fact that is represented by this, like the fact that the Eiffel Tower is tall. Okay, so you can then distinguish by saying that, look, okay, the representation has a certain form. It's a subject predicate kind of representation. The fact, you can say, has a certain structure. It's an object property kind of fact. Okay, so to talk about the structure of the fact is just to say that it's a fact of an object having a property. And lots of other facts are also facts of objects having properties, and they have therefore the same structure in this sort of supposedly innocent sense. Okay, and then you can wonder, okay, what's the relationship between the form of our representations and the structure of the fact that they represent? Is there some sort of explanation about why in these cases they match up perfectly? So a subject-predicate representational form is a perfect match for a subject, a subject-predicate form for a object property fact of that kind of structure. Okay, so is there an explanation about why these two go together? And so you can say that, well, okay, which one comes first explanatorily, one or the other, the structure or the form? Right, so on a standard kind of, broadly realist kind of picture, you say that the structure comes first. The world is just the totality of these facts. The facts have the structure, they're objects having properties. Our minds develop in such a world, they pick up on the structure, they form representations in correspondence to this. So we have separate representations for the object and separate representations for the property, leading to a subject-predicate form of a representation. And that's why there is this connection between form and structure in this particular case. Okay, and so that all sounds pretty good. But so then the question is, all right, should you expect that for every fact with some sort of structure, there's always a form among our representations that perfectly matches that structure? So subject-predicate, sure, we have that. There's a bunch of other structures you can, like conjunctive or whatever the structures are. We have that too. But should we think that for every structure that might be found among the facts, there's always a form in our representations that matches that perfectly? Okay, and so the thought is that if that were the case, then structural ineffability would be ruled out. Okay, so and that basically means the following. So if you think about a particular fact, you can wonder, can I represent that fact in thought or language conceptually? Okay, and so if the fact is a fact of an object having a property, right, then at least I have the right kinds of representations available to represent a fact like that. I have subject-predicate representations available, but I might still not be able to represent the object or represent the property. Okay, so if that happens, I have the right form of a thought available, but I can't fill in the form. So that's what I want to call content ineffable. Right? But it could be worse in a sense. It could be that the fact has a structure that's so different than the kind of facts that we can represent that we don't even have the right form of a representation available. Okay, then I can't even capture a fact with that kind of structure. Okay, so that will be structurally ineffable.
Right.
So when a fact is ineffable, it could be because of its structure that we can't capture, or because we can't fill the structure in, and then it's a content ineffability.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if structural ineffability is ruled out, if that never happens, then there's structural harmony between our thoughts or our conceptual representations and reality as the totality of facts.
Right.
And if ineffable facts are ruled out completely, then there's complete harmony.
Right.
Okay. And so the thought is that in the paper, I want to give an argument that structural harmony is guaranteed to be ruled out. And because of that, the explanation for that is something about us. It's something about our minds that guarantees that structural harmony is always ruled out. So there's a guarantee that our minds and the world is in structural harmony. And that is then taken to be a form of idealism.
Right. I was thinking of a sort of a joke question, which is the following.
Okay.
Could you give a specific example of a structurally ineffable fact?
No, because I think there aren't any.
Exactly.
Right? So, I mean,
Yeah. And you couldn't even represent them even if they're
even if you believe there are any, you couldn't give an example of them.
Right.
But that doesn't mean you can't argue that there are any. So there's a lot of good arguments that you should expect there to be some. You might just think about, like, why would our minds be good enough to represent absolutely every structure that could be found among the facts in all of reality? Why would that be? It would be an accident.
Right.
So we might get lucky that our forms of representations are good enough to represent every fact with regards to its structure, but it would be a lucky accident. There should be no guarantee. So why would it be guaranteed that our minds are good enough to capture every structure, so that the forms of our representations are good enough to capture every structure of a fact that could possibly be found in reality?
Right.
And so the argument I want to give is supposed to guarantee that. It's supposed to guarantee that there is never going to be any structural ineffability.
Right.
It's guaranteed not to be so.
And the argument you're using, essentially, it's a conditional. The article kind of goes for a conditional claim, although you say you find the particular view, the antecedent of the conditional, to be quite plausible. But just to rehash the kind of view in the philosophy of language that you're saying leads to the non-existence of structurally ineffable facts is a view about quantification over facts and propositions. So you distinguish internalism about such quantifiers from externalism. And although this is a kind of a very detailed matter, you could go read the article if you want more details on it. But could you just say very kind of briefly how internalism, like what internalism is, and then how that would lead to the, in a sense, trivial proof that there are no structurally ineffable facts?
All right. So let me just clarify. So. In the paper, though this paper that we're talking about today, in the paper, I argue for the conditional claim. Yeah. So I say there's a certain view in the philosophy of language that should be on the table for everybody, and if that view is correct, then idealism follows. Right. Now, it's not just true that I find this view plausible, which is also true, but I have sort of defended that view in detail in my first book, Ontology and the Ambitions of Metaphysics. So that one goes over all the stuff about quantification, about that clauses, the semantic treatment of that clauses, and fact terms, and all this. But that's just too big of a topic to be squeezed into that paper. So for the purpose of the paper, it's just a conditional claim, but the conditional claim is supposed to be surprising, anyways, even because it argues that from considerations in the philosophy of language alone, you can argue that idealism is true. Okay, so here's how it's supposed to go, in a nutshell. Okay, so if you have that clauses, so when you talk about facts in ordinary English, right? So you use that clauses. You said a fact that snow is white and things like that, and fact terms, which are basically the longer expression, like that snow is white is a fact. So I'm talking about the fact, that snow is white with that clause, or I can use the fact that snow is white like a fact term. Okay, so. There's a question about whether or not fact terms are like names in the sense that they're referential, that the semantic function is to pick out some entity, a fact, right? And that's a debate that is an ongoing debate. So there's some arguments for and against. Like one argument, against referentiality are these so-called substitution arguments. So that if they were referential, they should be substitutable for co-referential expressions. Unless some special explanation can be given, why not? But that doesn't seem to be always the case. So, for example, there seems to be a difference between John fears that his mother will find out, or John fears the fact that his mother will find out. Like if you think about that, one sounds more like fact phobia, and the other one is like fear related to your mother. So, okay, that's like just a debate. Okay, so people can disagree about this. But so relatedly, so if you think that fact terms are non-referential, there's a question about what's going on with quantification over facts. So when I say every fact is, either unexplainable or a surprise, I don't know, something like that, right? I'm quantifying over facts. What am I doing? So if you think that quantifiers just range over some domain of entities, but fact terms don't refer to entities, then that's sort of like intention. So you have to have some view about quantification that's not just motivated by ontological consideration or something like that, but rather by like what's actually going on in natural language about when we quantify over facts, or when quantifiers interact with that clauses and stuff like that. Okay, so in my last book, the one before the idealism one, I defended a view that quantification over facts is like essentially inferential. So the quantifiers are used in an inferential reading. So they have this, this domain conditions reading where they range over a domain of entities, but they also have an inferential reading where they inferentially interact with language internal instances of a sentence. So to bring out the difference, so one example I like is the example, everything exists. Okay, everything exists. So is that true or false? So on the one hand, it seems clearly true because all the things that you'd be talking about with everything, they all exist. They're all like, entities, they all exist, on standard views at least. But on the other hand, it seems surprising how you can accept that because you know of lots of instances or examples of things that don't exist. Like Santa doesn't exist, the Easter Bunny doesn't exist. So how can you say everything exists when you know of instances of things that don't exist? Okay, the answer is supposed to be the quantifier everything is semantically underspecified. It has different readings. It's polysemous. And one reading is this domain conditions reading, where it ranges over a domain, where it's true that everything exists. And the other one is this inferential reading, where it relates to instances. And on that one, it's false that everything exists. Because Santa doesn't exist, so not everything exists. So that's the picture. Okay, so then the thought is that that's sort of true about quantification in general. And that view of quantification nicely goes with this non-referential picture of fact terms. So the thought here is that these inferential quantifiers can perfectly well interact with fact terms, even though they're not referential. So, like the fact that, I don't know, that snow is, that's a bad example, but, the fact that I won at chess is surprising. So therefore, something is surprising. How do you understand that? On the inferential reading of the quantifier, it's a trivial inference. It always works. It doesn't matter if the relevant expression is referential or not. Okay, so then the question is, okay, what is this? What are the truth conditions of the inferential reading? And that's relevant for this idealism stuff now. Okay, so this is a bit of a subtle question, but like leaving all the subtleties aside and focusing only on the simplest case, you can just think of that as something is surprising on the inferential reading is truth conditionally equivalent to all the instances in your own language that imply it. So the inferential reading is supposed to be inferentially relating instances in your own language, internal, so to speak. It's just a language internal thing. And so the truth conditions, the simplest truth conditions that give you that inferential behavior is truth conditional equivalent to the disjunction of all the instances. Okay, right. So that's that's too simple to be actually correct, but it's a first good enough approach for present purposes. Okay, so then, I should add that when you get rid of the simplifications, it still works for the argument of idealism. That's developed in the idealism book, but not so much in the idealism paper. Okay, so now let's think about the issue. So harmony. Let's go back to the idealism. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So here's the argument. So harmony obtains. Structural harmony, just in case every fact is structurally effable. Okay? Right. Now, suppose internalism, this view that depth classes are not referential and quantifiers over facts and propositions are used in their inferential reading. Suppose that's true. That's what I call internalism, as you said. And they're illegitimately using the internal-external metaphor one too many times. Yeah. But, okay, so if internalism is true, then it applies to the very statement that I'm making right now. It's a claim about English, so it's a claim about our present language. So it applies to the statement, every fact is structurally effable. But that statement is true. Well, we only talked about the particular quantifier, but for the universal quantifier, it's just that's truth condition equivalent to the conjunction of all the instances. So every fact is structurally effable. That's truth condition equivalent, roughly speaking, to, if it's a fact that P, then, it's structurally effable that P. And the P now is for all the instances in my own language. But for each instance, it's always true because each instance is structurally effable by me, by human beings. And so it is just a consequence of this sort of semantics for quantification and for depth clauses and fact terms that every fact is structurally effable is guaranteed to come out true. Right. Okay. And then the thought is, well, all right, so idealism is not established simply because harmony obtains. So if harmony obtains, that could be by accident, right? It could be that, well, the world is super simple. It's all objects having properties. That's all the structure among the facts. So we are lucky we can represent structurally all the facts. But if internalism is true, then it's not by accident that every fact is structurally effable. It's true for a reason, and the reason is connected to us. It's connected to us and our representations and stuff like that. So that's why I'm claiming that the internalist argument for that structural affability is ruled out and that structural harmony is guaranteed is an argument that there's a reason for this harmony obtaining, and the reason is connected to us, and that is sufficient to establish idealism and the third answer to the place of human beings in reality.
Yeah.
So that's the argument in a nutshell.
That's the argument. Yeah. So it's a really nice argument. But now I'll go on to ask some sort of questions about it, some maybe critical remarks in some ways.
Okay.
But like I'd say like a latter half of your article, like after this argument, is a lot about a possible rejoinder to this, which seems to kind of come fairly easily, and that is, how could you, ever argue for such a conclusion merely on the basis of philosophy of language? And I was thinking of something sort of similar to that in relation to the book, which I think you developed there, which is that roughly the sort of rejoinder that, well, this might be true for our way of using quantifiers, but there might be other existence quantifiers over facts, or we can imagine other linguistic communities which have similar which use similar modes of language but are not identical. And I was wondering if your views on metaphysics come in here to kind of say that strategy doesn't work. I know you're writing about on inescapable concepts. So is that
right? Okay, so that actually
so
that stuff is all relevant for the defense of the idealism, the inescapable concepts in particular, but it's actually, I think, not relevant for the rejoinder to that particular objection that you've just raised, which is a very good objection. It's a very plausible objection in the sense that you said that, look, I'm saying that, look, our talk about facts is internalist stuff about non-referential back clauses, inferential uses of quantifiers. So that's just contingent. We could as well, I'm just repeating the objection as you stated, right? So we could as well use the quantifier externally. Why not use it externally over the domain conditions reading? Because even on my view about quantification, like which reading of the quantifier you use is in the end up to the speaker. It's not like, both of them are available. So you could use it externally, and other language communities might use quantification externally, and so on and so forth. So therefore, is it some sort of relativism? Is it just that for us there are no facts, but for them there are, and stuff like that? Facts are, tied to our representations. Okay, so I think that argument doesn't work because the question is, it is true that other creatures could quantify externally, but they can't quantify externally over facts.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is simply this, that if fact terms are non-referential, then it follows from that facts do not exist. And that's just simply by the following consideration. So when we say that fact terms are not referential, the thought is it's not that they aim to refer but fail. Right, but rather they're non-referential in the second sense, like what, let's call it constitutively non-referential or something like that, where their function itself, the semantic function, is nothing like reference. They are, they can occupy subject position in sentences and stuff like that, but they do not even aim to refer. They do something else semantically.
Right.
Okay, and so if that's true, then the thought is that you could wonder, could it be that any particular thing is the fact that snow is white? Okay, so here's an argument that's ruled out because take the totality of all that exists right here and pick one thing out at random. Pick something out. Okay, this one. Now, could that thing be the fact that snow is white? Now, if internalism is true, then my present sentence that I just uttered like one sentence ago, could this be the fact that snow is white? When I say this, I'm demonstratively referring to that entity that I just picked out.
Yeah.
When I say the fact that snow is white, I'm not even referring at all. So therefore, this thing is not identical to the fact that snow is white.
Right.
So it's not the fact that snow is white. So it must be some other thing. And the same is true for all. Sorry?
A schfact. A fact star.
Right. Okay. So whatever it might be. I mean, I just picked it at random. It might be like a Toyota Prius or whatever. So it could be anything.
Yeah.
And so far, the argument just is that, look, if internalism is true for our talk about facts, then not only is it true that we don't talk about entities, but it's also true that nobody else is talking about facts as entities because there are no facts as entities.
Okay.
It just follows that there are no entities that are facts. Now, and then we get to the fact star stuff, and then we get to the stuff about inescapable concepts and stuff like that.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking
so
about.
That's really sort of right. So okay, so this whole idealism business, like the argument, right? So it could be wrong in a number of different ways. Okay, so one obvious one is that this whole philosophy of language stuff, the stuff that I worked out or tried to in my earlier book about internalism and fact talk and quantification, that's all wrong, and that's of course certainly on the table, right? So, but then. Well, I'm leaving that aside, okay? Because the real suspicious issue about this whole strategy of argumentation is that you couldn't possibly establish this by just thinking about your own representations of the world. Like, how could you argue that idealism is true just by thinking about, here's how I'm talking about facts. That's just about you and not about the world. So this is the one that's really the sort of the most promising line to object to it, I would say. And I think to work out why that line isn't successful is actually quite revealing about like how this argument fits into a sort of a larger picture. And a lot of the stuff is not in the paper, but in the book. So in the book that I developed this idea about, immanent metaphysics and the significance of inescapable concepts and stuff like that. I mean, I won't jump ahead, but I guess. But that's the strategy. And so the argument that, well, couldn't other people quantify externally about facts? The response to that argument is sort of independent of that so far. Right. That doesn't bring in this other stuff yet.
Yeah. I was thinking more about the other stuff, but I must say I'm looking forward to reading the book when it comes out. But So another thought I had with regards to this was, I mean, roughly, okay, so if internalism about quantification is true, quantification over facts is true for all language, then this holds. But I was wondering if you could use something like Moore's open question argument to kind of show that that isn't the case, because the mere fact that we can ask this question as sort of an open question in the philosophy of language, whether sort of the existence quantifier when used over facts is cognitively synonymous to an inferentialist quantifier, and it's an open question whether that holds, that would go to show that they're not synonymous in our language. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that.
It's not supposed to be synonymy. So it's supposed to be that it's kind of like, more like an empirical linguistic discovery.
Right.
So, I guess the thought is that, and this is generally true, for example, examples like polysemy or something like that. So you can be a very competent speaker of your language without recognizing that certain expressions are polysemous, have a number of different readings. So the one that's, I think, quite plausible is this, these sort of what's called like reciprocal expressions, like each other. So there's a real question about how many different readings does each other have. So for example, so like the example, these are all classic examples from linguistic literature. But so like when you say like the exits on the highway are less than a mile from each other, right? So that basically means that there's always another one after at most a mile. But it's not true that every exit is at most 1 mile from every other exit, right? But when you say something like, the students all sat within 10 feet of each other, then usually you want to say that, they're all at most 10 feet from each other, not that, both of them are available, I guess, but, in many cases, these are just different readings of each other, I guess, is the thought.
Right.
And there could be a whole bunch more. And so it's not that this is something that's conceptually obvious or conceptually equivalent or something like that. It's just like things are underspecified in language. They can be specified in different ways. And it's not that, these are conceptual equivalences. They can often be discovered.
Right. Okay, well, I have a question in regard to this, because this podcast, the name of this podcast is Determinate Content, because I was wondering whether I should call it Indeterminate Content or Determinate, and I chose Determinate Content. But I was just wondering if we think it is open, it's an open question, and that's possible because you don't require cognitive synonymy or conceptual links or anything. I mean, do you think there is there a fact of the matter whether we're using the inferential quantifier or the externalist quantifier, or the domain specific?
Yeah, I mean, right. So it could be indeterminate. I guess that's open, but certainly often I think there is a fact of the matter. It's kind of like when you say, like, is there a fact of the matter that the exits on the highway are less than a mile from each other?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a fact that you meant like, each exit is at most 1 mile from every other exit,
Mm-hmm.
or that for every exit there's another one that's at most a mile away from that first one, right?
Mm-hmm.
Presumably in ordinary contexts, like when we're talking about, oh yeah, you can get off the highway easily because the exits are at most, they're all within a mile from each other.
Mm.
So it doesn't really matter which exit you take, you're at most a mile away from where you want to go. Then I think, it's a fact that I had these truth conditions where, they're lined up in a row such that there's no more than a mile between them, rather than the truth conditions where every exit is at most a mile from every other exit.
Mm-hmm.
Because that one wouldn't make any sense. So, so I think the same is probably true for the inferential versus domain conditions reading of the quantifiers. In many cases, I think, yes, but in some other cases, it might be indeterminate. It might not be specified.
Okay.
So I mean, so just about this, like your indeterminate versus determinate content thing. So this whole thing about like, so there's a couple of different worries about like determinacy of content. Like I don't know, like Quine had some stuff about this and stuff like that. So, but this debate here is really, this is just about like how much of the determinacy of the content is to be found at the level of language, and how much is to be found at the level of assertion or utterance or something like that.
Right. Okay.
How big is the gap between them? Because when you say that something is polysemous or semantically underspecified, it's not that content itself is underspecified or something like that. It's just that at the level of language, the word everything is not fully determinate, like what the contribution of the truth conditions are at the level of an utterance.
Yeah.
But at the level of an utterance, it can be perfectly determinate, that you meant the, like, oh, now it's used in this particular way. Kind of like each other, like the level of language, it just constrains a number of different interpretations that this word might have, number of different contributions to the truth conditions that are related in certain ways. But then at the level of assertion, it might be perfectly determinate.
Right. So you would say you kind of reject any principled argument against, sort of the determinacy of, even at the level of assertion, that,
it's not really. So I think that's a very separate topic from what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I was just thinking, with regards to supporting this from supporting idealism from philosophy of language. Maybe that supposes that there are determinate facts in philosophy of language. But yeah. So I was thinking, that they might be related in that way.
Yeah, I see. I mean, I don't know. I don't think the argument presupposes anything particular about determinacy of content or something like that. It's all carried out at the level of, you use the language, you characterize the view that you want to defend in your own language, and then you look at your own language, in particular the language you use in characterizing the view, and you notice certain things, and you see that, oh yeah, that view must be true.
You're right.
So no further assumptions are made about the nature of content or anything like that, I think.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I was wondering, another adjacent question was just kind of on the broad topic of sort of representationalism and attacks against representationalism. And I was thinking here of like sort of the neo-pragmatist strain that would, in many cases argue that the whole realism versus idealism question, or to a certain degree, the need to establish harmony between language or thought or our modes of knowledge and the world, on the other hand, presupposes that there are these two things that need to be linked in some way. But if you get rid of content, you get rid of that representationalist link, you don't have to, the whole dispute between idealism and realism would just kind of dissolve. And I was kind of curious as to your do you think that they're wrong? It's just a question.
So let me just all right, so let me just see. So there's really two different debates, right? One is between, and both of them use the word realism, but they're really different debates, I think. Okay, so one of them is between realism and anti-realism. And the other one is between realism and idealism. So the one I'm engaged in is the second one. So the realist here holds that minds play no metaphysically special role in the world. So the world is just minds arise in the world. They're puzzling features of the world, but the overall metaphysical story of the world does not give minds a special place. That's the realist in this sense, okay? The realist goes against the idealist who thinks that minds do play a special role, for one reason or another. There's a number of different ways. Either the world itself is mental, or the world is all a feature of the mind of God. That's like a version of idealism, not for the place of human beings, but like it's idealism in the sort of broad sense. In any case, so that's realism versus idealism. Okay, that's a debate about the metaphysical place of minds in the world. So that debate at first has nothing to do with assertions or content or language or something like that. It's just about what's the role of minds in metaphysics. Okay. And then there's the other debate between realism and anti-realism. Okay, that's about morality, is it really an expression of your preferences and feelings, or is it descriptive of moral facts? That sounds more like it's about language, it's about representations, assertions, and stuff like that. Okay, so, but I think these are very different debates, because the idealist, let's say, can be a perfect realist in the realism anti-realism sense. So for example, suppose you believe that everything is exactly as you think it is from the naturalistic picture is almost completely correct. Minds arise out of accident, blah, blah, blah. But there's one more layer below. Matter ultimately is an aspect of the mind of God. Okay. Now, that view is perfectly compatible with whatever view about morality or the philosophy of time about the future, or whatever classic anti-realist areas you might have about aesthetic judgment or something like that. The world is it's just everything is exactly like most people believe, except right. So similarly, if somebody says no, that lowest layer, that fundamentally everything is an aspect of the mind of God, that isn't there, and matter is a distinctly non-mental thing, then that person can agree about everything else about morality and aesthetics and the future and so on and so forth. So those are really two separate debates. So so when you talk about the neo-pragmatists, so the neo-pragmatists, there's probably a very diverse group of people that have all kinds of different views and so on and so forth. But I can see somebody, saying that this whole debate about realism versus anti-realism is based on confusion or something like that, because it assumes a sharp distinction between, which language is descriptive and which language is expressive, let's say in one version, and maybe you think that, that distinction collapses and so on and so forth, and so therefore the whole debate collapses. But that collapse would not affect the debate about realism and idealism as I'm engaged in it. So that debate has its own problems. One of the most serious ones is, how do you characterize the realist and idealist view? And is there a substantial difference, or is it just some sort of broad vision that you might have? So this is, related to issues about, if somebody says, well, the idealists hold that the world is mind dependent, then the question, okay, what sense of dependence do you mean? And so is there a legitimate sense of dependence where you get a non-trivial view that can be articulated as the idealist or even the realist position? So like when people, and I don't know, like when people are quietists about this, they usually say that there just isn't a legitimate distinction that can be drawn. There's nothing to debate here. Stop talking about this. And so I think that's a mistake. So I think that there's a real problem about how to characterize the difference, but I think that problem can be solved. And I've tried to make a proposal both in the article as well as in the book about how these positions should be stated, how they can be stated in sort of perfectly accessible, non-esoteric terms, and all this, and without relying on primitive notions of dependence and stuff like that.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. Because one of my questions was also related to that, but I wanted to ask for clarification because some conceptions of idealism are just kind of flat out sort of the world is mental or something like that. But that's not the sort of idealism you're going for here. The sort of idealism you concern is firstly the harmony of thought and reality, but also the sort of the grounds of this harmony, or the explanatory source of the harmony. And sort of just to kind of get into to see what I mean, like early Wittgenstein sort of argued for the same thing, that the world is a totality of facts, and to each fact corresponds a proposition, and this proposition can be framed in thought. So the world is, the totality of facts are constrained within language to a certain degree. And then later Wittgenstein kind of dismantled this whole picture, or wanted to, and then for him, the idea is that this problem just fades away with the relationship between thought or language and reality, and that's the kind of idealism which I'm wondering if it is it just a metaphysical claim, or is it not also a claim about the relationship between language or thought and the world? So it's not just a worldly claim like everything is mental, but it's a relational claim on your
Okay, I mean, the Wittgenstein thing is always tricky because there's like a lot of scholarship and stuff like that involved. Yeah. But so let's see. So if somebody says the world is mental, and I mean it not in the British English sense, but in the sort of right. So that usually is a claim that I would say fits into ontological idealism.
Yes.
So when somebody says the world is mental, they mean that this particular cup is really a mental thing. In one version or another, right? It's an aspect of the mind of God, or it's a construction of my own sensory phenomenal states, or whatever, right? Yeah. So that's a claim in ontological idealism. So that's very different than a kind of harmony claim, because the harmony claim is just about the structure of the facts corresponds exactly to the forms of our representations in the structural case, and in the stronger complete harmony case, they completely match up. And that is independent, I think, of the ontological idealist case. So whether or not the world, the objects themselves are mental or not mental, or derivative on the mental, or grounded in the mental, or whatever you might have, is a separate question about harmony. So my own view is that the ontological idealism thing is not going to fly, and there's some good reasons against that. But the other one is correct. But overall, then idealism is true because like the Alethic idealism that concerns reality of facts is correct. Okay, so I mean the Wittgenstein thing, I mean I feel like Wittgenstein comes at it like from I don't know. I mean, there are definitely similarities between Wittgenstein in the sense that there's this close matchup between our conceptual representations and reality. But the argument for it is very different. It's not that there is some sort of general form of a fact or something like that, and that corresponds to the general form of a sentence and things like that. So I'm not much of a Wittgenstein scholar,
right?
So I shouldn't conjecture of what precisely is going on in Wittgenstein. But
right, yeah, let's spare us both the trouble. But okay, well, if we take it to be just a metaphysical claim, then I wanted to ask you this. I've been very eager to ask you this. So you have like a very fierce, ferocious writing in this Metaphysics Bible book, the new essays in the Foundations of Ontology, where you argue that sort of contemporary theorizing about grounding and so on are trying to give a metaphysically special standing to those notions, but that's not possible. I was just wondering, in framing this idea, this metaphysical idea of harmony, do you not have to use some notion of dependence or priority here, which is distinctively metaphysical in framing this? So for example, what I'm trying to get at here is that, for example, let's say that I look at a fact in front of me right now. So there is a computer in front of me. This fact has a certain structure, and then the idealist, the structural idealist, wants to claim that this is in some way dependent on me. But to me, it doesn't seem like it's modally dependent on me. So if I were to, if I didn't exist, or if no humans existed, the fact would still have the same structure, and that would suggest to me that the dependence where the idealist is talking about is not a modal sort of dependence, but is more akin to the sort of grounding stuff. And I was wondering how do you view those, like the...
So let me just clarify this. So it's not the case that, I don't believe that the only sense of dependence is only modal dependence or something like that. So it's not that, other kinds of dependence are forbidden or something like that, and modality is somehow special, and so on and so forth. So that's clearly not the case. We often have like all kinds of non-causal explanations. We explain things in mathematics in a non-modal way,
right?
And so on and so forth. So there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong, I think, with either non-causal explanation or hyper-intentional notions or something like that, which are present all over the place. There's also nothing wrong with metaphysical senses of dependence. So there's all kinds of good metaphysical senses of dependence. Some of them are modal, some of them are not modal. What's wrong, what's bad, I think, is something that people, I don't know if this is still true these days, but at least back in the day when this volume came out, there were these people that just were like, we accept this primitive notion of grounding.
Yeah.
It can't be articulated or spelled out any further way. I mean, it can be approximated with examples and stuff like that, but we accept this notion, and then we turn the subject matter of metaphysics towards that notion. So so what we're doing is we say, the subject matter of metaphysics is to determine, what is ungrounded, or in one version of it, what is ungrounded, or what is grounded in reality. So Kate Fine has this version where and that's in some sense the most egregious, but also in some sense also not as offensive as it might seem. So you assume that there's a primitive notion of reality, which is distinct from the ordinary notion of reality.
Yeah,
it's distinct in metaphysical notion. Reality with capital R.
Yeah.
It has to be accepted as a primitive notion in metaphysical theorizing, and the subject matter of metaphysics is to determine what's true in reality. Okay, so let's say one version. Okay, so here this seemed to me to be objectionable because of its its esoteric nature. So if somebody asks you, okay, well, what is metaphysics supposed to do? Find out what's true in reality. Okay, so can you say more about what that is? No. Oh, it's a primitive. So I feel like the discipline becomes in a little bit pointless because you can neither, so this is like what they call like the problem of insufficient content and the problem of insufficient value, right? It's not clear that you mean anything precise by reality in a sense, and that it's not clear what the value is of finding out what's true in reality in a sense, because it's just this primitive notion. So similarly for grounding, so some people have used grounding saying, look, we accept it as a primitive further notion, and it can only be approximated by some examples, but then the subject matter of metaphysics is formulated in terms of grounding in this primitive sense. So if you wonder what's metaphysics supposed to do, blah blah blah, grounding, blah blah blah, and so that I thought was objectionable. Okay, so it's objectionable to use primitive unexplained terms when you state what the subject matter of metaphysics itself is. You can use them in different ways, like as theoretical, constants and so on and so forth. But then the question that you're aiming to answer has to be stated in accessible terms. So that's sort of basically the what I thought was objectionable about relying on grounding in this really extreme way that So this obviously there's a huge literature on this now, and I don't know if people still do it in such an egregious way, but at least back then, that seemed quite clearly objectionable. But that shouldn't be confused with thinking that non-causal explanation is not allowed, or only modal notions are allowed, or any of these things.
Right. Okay, fair enough. No, I'm not saying that you're banishing them. It just sounded to me that when you say that the structure of the facts in some sense depends on us, that the notion of dependence there is dependence, a strong table banging.
So I want to use the notion of range dependence.
Right.
So range dependence is that the range of what in principle can be a fact, like the limits of what the facts can be like, is tied to our minds. And that basically is the thought, is that for present debate, structural ineffability is ruled out for a reason that is connected to us. So there's a reason why structural ineffability is ruled out, and that reason is about us in some sense. Okay, so that's not it just depends, and I can't say what dependence is or something like that.
Right.
It's I'll explain to you what the reason is. It is because the totality of all the facts is tied to all of our representations because of what the truth conditions are of the quantifier, all the facts, as I specify the totality of all the facts. So it's something about our language that guarantees that all the facts are structurally effable.
Right.
That's the reason, but it's not relying on a primitive sense of dependence where I then, let's say I characterize it only axiomatically, and then I claim that there's mental dependence in this primitive sense or something like that. So,
right.
So it is true that is it's a non-causal explanation. It's not like, I'm not saying that the totality is caused to be restricted, and so the totality of all the facts is caused to be restricted.
Yeah.
But it's not a primitive sense of dependence. It's a sense of dependence that is articulated, spelled out, in ordinary English and so on and so forth, without relying on primitive, unexplained.
Yeah. All right. Well, that makes sense.
So to contrast, for example, if somebody says, it's a transcendental precondition of, I don't know, whatever, so something like that. You ask me what does that mean, transcendental precondition? I say, well, it's a primitive term of metaphysics. Then I would say, well, all right, that doesn't really help now, because we want to say, what is, why, how does the mind come in to limit and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah. I just recollected this story about a philosophy professor and his two graduate students who are working on the definition of a chocolate cake, a dessert. And then the solution is that something is a dessert if and only if it is served on a dessert plate. And then someone asks, well, what is a dessert plate then? And they say, it's a conceptual primitive. So I guess, but okay, so I guess we should wrap up soon, but I had one further question. So just on the topic of sort of contemporary metaphysics, this sort of stuff. So you want to distinguish pretty sharply your notion of structure from this Ted Sider kind of notion of structure, which is the way that the world is carved out at the joints. And I wanted to ask you in relation to the philosophy of science. So at least certain philosophies of science argue, and I'm not a scientist myself, and I'm not very into philosophy of science. But they argue that the world structure does not match the subject-predicate structure in our language, because ultimately the world is only the world doesn't contain any things, right? It just contains properties. So ontic structural realism, and James Ladyman. So he says we have to revise our entire language to speak correctly about the world in fundamental terms. I was wondering if this sort of idealism a priori rules out that the world is like that, or whether it would just say that, well, the facts of the world, the fact star could be like that, but that wouldn't matter because we are concerned with facts. We're not concerned. Or what would your response to that be?
Okay, so first, just to clarify, so the form of idealism I defend is not really a priori. So it relies on broadly empirical facts about our own language that are the kind of things. So whether or not those count as a priori or not is a little bit maybe dicey, but it's not the reflection on the concept of a fact alone and so on and so forth. It's empirical facts about what we do when we quantify and so on and so forth. So for the structural realist, if the structural realist says that it's not subject predicate things, object property facts that are the fundamental ones, that would be totally fine. It's totally compatible with the view, as long as whatever the facts are still structurally effable. So it could well be that it's a different structure, but it's nonetheless an effable structure.
Okay, yeah.
So then I'd have to see more about what particular view somebody presents. But if somebody just says that it's all what's fundamental is just the relations, and not the relata, that's totally fine. In principle, because you're using the same sort of general kind of conceptual representation, the same structural features like objects, properties, relations, except you say that these aspects are more fundamental than these other aspects.
Yeah.
But if somebody said that the fundamental facts are just ineffable, they're so I'm the kind of realist who says, a made up version now that it's not objects and properties, it's not structure, it's not relations, something like that. It's rather some ineffable bottom layer that gives rise to the other stuff. That's incompatible.
That's incompatible. Yeah. Okay.
So, unless somebody claims that those are not facts or something like that, but I mean, I don't know, that you know.
Okay. I have one last.
Okay. So if somebody says the fundamental facts are ineffable, that's incompatible because ineffability, or for what we've talked about so far, structural ineffability is just ruled out.
Right. Okay. Well, okay. I have one last question, if that's fine. So, in the book, as you say, that you developed immanent metaphysics. And I was just wondering, so I have two questions. So the first one is, what is the relationship between immanent metaphysics and certain sort of easy approaches to ontology or metaphysics? And the second question is, what do you think if idealism turns out to be true, we're all speaking in the inferential quantifier about facts propositions, what do you think that leads to, like, the future of metaphysics? What does that say about the discipline of metaphysics, and how should it be revised, or so those two questions?
So there is no direct relationship between immanent metaphysics and easy ontology, like in the sense of Immanent or something like that. I mean, I would say no direct relationship. There are two features, maybe, or one feature obviously that's related, is both of them focus on your own language to try to make progress in metaphysics. Mm-hmm. But for the immanent metaphysician, nothing is easy. It's it's none of the stuff that, say, Amy Thomason uses about why ontological questions are easy and conceptual connections and so on and so forth, and all this stuff. None of that stuff appears in immanent metaphysics. Okay, so immanent metaphysics, in the sense that I'm using it, it's a methodology to make progress in metaphysics. It's perfectly compatible with other methodologies. It's not like, it's exclusive or something like that. But so the argument for idealism is one instance of this. And so immanent metaphysics aims to generalize it. In particular, in according to one aspect that we haven't really talked about, which is this idea to inescapable concepts. Which is crucial because immanent metaphysics is supposed to sort of like lead to a merger of metaphysics, philosophy of language, and epistemology, because they're all crucially involved in this immanent metaphysics project. Okay, so and here's the main thought is this, so that you recognize that sometimes you can draw conclusions about what reality is like from simply reflecting on your own language alone. Okay, so one example that we've talked about earlier was this idea that you can conclude that facts are not entities, facts do not exist, simply from considerations about your own language, namely that fact terms are constitutively non-referential.
Right.
Okay. So similarly, I claim that you can draw a conclusion about the role of human minds in reality simply from reflecting on our own language and our own talk about facts.
Yes.
So that's the idealism. But then you get this problem that, all right, so maybe all this shows is that we have, like, metaphysically unsuitable concepts.
Yeah.
This is the stuff about facts star. We haven't talked about this, but so the idea that, maybe we shouldn't talk about facts, that's all metaphysically unsuitable, et cetera, et cetera. We should talk about facts star. Okay. Yeah. And then there's this line of argument that I pursue in the book and some other papers, but not so much in the paper that, or maybe it's a little bit in the paper. A little bit. So the thought is that, okay, could it ever be rational for me to replace my concept of a fact with an alternative fact star?
Yeah.
Okay. And so the thought is that if you have a concept such that it's always irrational for you to replace it with an alternative concept, and then you have to spell that out, what that would mean, and so on and so forth. But if there is such a concept, you can call that an inescapable concept, a concept that you cannot rationally escape. And I argue that the concept of a fact is a concept like that. So and so therefore you cannot say that, oh, well, all right, we've established that we are metaphysically central to reality as a totality of facts, but that was the wrong concept of reality. It focused on fact star, reality star, and so on and so forth. And that is ruled out. And so this is a consideration about what's rational for you to do. So it involves considerations from epistemology. Okay, so then immanent metaphysics basically says, okay, look at all the concepts that you have that are inescapable for you. Look at what conclusions you can draw about reality by reflecting on, your talk or thought about the subject matter of these concepts, like, the totality of facts or many other things like that. And draw all the conclusions about reality that you can draw from that. So you focus on inescapability of the relevant concepts, considerations in the philosophy of language about what you do when you talk involving those concepts. And you draw metaphysical conclusions about reality. And then sort of the results of immanent metaphysics can be combined or augmented, or merged in with results in totally different parts of metaphysics, like, considerations from sciences or pure,
Right.
theoretical virtue kind of reflection on metaphysics and so on and so forth. So it's supposed to be one method of making progress that sort of generalizes from this kind of considerations that we've been talking about.
Well, I think that's a great kind of cliffhanger until the book comes out. But I'm really looking forward to getting to it. But for now, thank you so much for talking about the paper.
And good luck with the podcast.
Yeah, thanks a lot.